The massive alien ships cut through Earth's blue sky like silver knives, their hulls gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside the lead vessel, Ambassador Kale pressed his face against the viewing port, his three eyes wide with disbelief. The scanner. Readings had to be wrong. They just had to be. Sir, I've run the diagnostics 5 times, his science officer reported, her voice tight with confusion. The energy signatures are still reading as impossible. Kale's stomach twisted as he looked. Down at the world below was supposed to be a dead planet, a cautionary tale. A graveyard of a species that had destroyed itself through greed and stupidity. That's what all the galactic records said. That's what every computer model predicted. Instead, he saw cities that seemed to breathe. Towers made of what looked like living crystal grew from the centers of vast forests. Rivers of light flowed between buildings like veins carrying life itself. Its very air seemed to shimmer with energy that his instruments couldn't identify. Prepare for landing, he ordered. Though his voice came out as barely a whisper, the landing pad was unlike anything in the galactic database. It appeared to be grown rather than built, with surfaces that felt warm and alive beneath their feet. As Kale stepped off his ship, the platform actually adjusted its shape to make his walking more comfortable. The technology was so advanced. It seemed like magic. A small group of humans waited for them. Kale had studied their species in preparation for this archaeological mission. They were supposed to be primitive, barely past their industrial age when they destroyed themselves. The beings standing before him looked anything but primitive. The leader was a woman with kind eyes and silver hair that caught the light in unusual ways. She wore simple clothes that seemed to shift color slightly as she moved. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Kale think of ancient mountains and deep oceans. "Welcome to Earth," she said with a smile that somehow made him feel both welcomed and humbled. "I'm Hannah. We understand you've come to study our ruins." Behind her stood others who seemed equally impossible. A tall man named June had hands that looked like they had worked with both soil and starlight. His eyes held the patience of someone who had learned to wait for seeds to grow. Next to him, a woman called Myra watched the aliens with eyes that seemed to contain the memory of every sunrise and sunset the planet had ever seen. "We're afraid you'll find our civilization quite intact," Hannah continued, and there was something almost playful in her tone. Kale's mind raced. This couldn't be right. His people had been monitoring Earth for centuries. They knew exactly what had happened here. Humans had poisoned their oceans, burned their forests, and fought wars over the last drops of clean water. The planet should have been empty for 200 years. "Our records," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "they show that your world suffered complete ecological collapse 3 centuries ago. Every model we ran predicted total civilizational death." Humans exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations. Hannah's expression grew soft, almost maternal. "We did collapse," she said simply. "Our civilization fell harder than any in galactic history. We lost nearly everything we thought made us human." Kale looked around at the impossible city surrounding. Them plants grew in perfect harmony with structures that hummed with power. The very air tasted clean and alive. Children played in gardens where flowers seemed to glow with their own inner light. But this, he gestured helplessly at the thriving world around them. How is any of this possible? June stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "We learned something during our collapse that perhaps other species haven't had to learn," he said. "We discovered that trying to conquer nature was our greatest mistake." "When everything fell apart," Mira added, her voice carrying the weight of inherited memory, "we had to choose between dying as we had lived or finding a completely new way to exist." Hannah nodded slowly. "The collapse wasn't our end. It was our beginning. We learned to listen instead of demand, to work with our world instead of against it, to build with life rather than in spite of it." Kale felt something shift in his understanding. His own species, the Vorthok, had conquered dozens of worlds. They had never faced true extinction. They had never been forced to completely reimagine what it meant to be alive. "From our collapse," Hannah continued, "we learned to truly live, not just survive, but to become part of something larger than ourselves." As the alien delegation was Led deeper into the impossible city, Kale realized that they hadn't come to study ruins at all. They had come to meet teachers. Earth hadn't died from its collapse. It had been reborn, transformed into something that defied every assumption about how civilizations were supposed to work. The humans walked beside them with quiet confidence, their footsteps somehow making the living ground beneath them pulse with gentle light. They had turned their greatest failure into their greatest strength, and somehow, that made them more powerful than any species in the galaxy. The building they entered felt alive, in ways that made Kale's skin crawl and his heart race at the same time. The walls seemed to pulse gently, like the inside of some vast, breathing creature. Soft light came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows, but somehow making everything perfectly visible. "This is our archive of remembrance," Anna said, as she led them through corridors that adjusted their width to accommodate the alien visitors. "Here we keep the complete record of our collapse and recovery." The main chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in misty darkness above. In the center, a massive sphere of light hovered in the air, its surface rippling with images that made Kale's stomach turn. He was looking at the death of a world. The first images showed Earth as it had been before the collapse. Beautiful cities, by clear oceans, green forests stretching to the horizon, millions of humans living in comfort and plenty. But as Kale watched, the pictures began to change. Ocean levels rose with terrifying speed, swallowing entire nations. The water that remained turned brown and toxic. Forests burned in fires so large they could be seen from space. Storms grew bigger and more violent, tearing apart buildings that had stood for hundreds of years. "Watch closely," said a man who stepped out of the shadows. He was older than the others, with deep lines around his eyes and hair that had gone completely white. "I am Day, keeper of these memories. What you're seeing is the Great Collapse." Kale couldn't look away, even though every image made him feel sick. He watched millions of humans fleeing from rising waters, their faces full of terror and desperation. He saw children crying over parents who had died from hunger. He witnessed wars fought with primitive weapons over the last patches of land that could still grow food. Between 2045 and 2087, Day continued, his voice steady despite the horror playing out before them, our population fell from 11 billion. Two fewer than 2 billion. We lost nearly everything we thought made us human. The images showed cities being abandoned, their towers falling into ruin, libraries burned while people fought over scraps of food, hospitals closed as medicine ran out. Schools stood empty because there were no children left to teach. "How did you survive this?" Kale whispered, his voice barely audible. A young woman stepped forward, and Kale noticed that her hands seemed to glow with the same soft light that powered the archive. Her name was Sue, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone whose family had lived through the impossible. "My great-grandmother was one of the survivors," she said. "She lived in what we called the underground networks. These were communities that formed in the deepest, darkest parts of the collapse, where people had to find new ways to stay alive." The hologram shifted, showing small groups of humans living in caves, tunnels, and hidden valleys. They looked different from the humans who had lived before the collapse. Thinner, harder, but somehow more alive. Their eyes held a knowledge that the comfortable humans of the earlier time had never possessed. "They discovered something important," Sue continued. "All our attempts to control and dominate nature had been our greatest mistake. The collapse taught them that humans were not separate from the natural world. We were part of it." Kale watched. As the images showed these underground humans doing things that seemed impossible, they were talking to plants, working with fungi that grew in strange patterns, learning to understand the language of damaged ecosystems. At first it looked like magic. Then he realized it was science beyond anything his own people had achieved. "They learned to listen," they explained. Instead of trying to force the world to give them what they wanted, they asked what the world needed. And when they started healing the planet started healing them. The technology that emerged from this partnership was unlike anything in the galactic databases. Kale saw humans growing buildings from living materials, creating energy from the breath of forests, and healing poisoned land by working with microscopic life forms that had survived the collapse. We call it the symbiosis, Hannah said, her voice full of quiet pride. Once we stopped trying to conquer our world and started listening to it, everything changed. The hologram showed the slow recovery. Year by year, the poisoned oceans began to clear. The burned forests started to grow back, but different than before. Stronger, more alive. The humans who emerged from the underground brought with them a completely new way of living. This is why our cities look impossible to you, Sue said, her glowing hands touching the wall of the archive. We don't build them. We grow them. We don't power them. We partner with them. We don't live on our world. We live as part of it. Cale felt his understanding of civilization crumble and rebuild itself. His own people had conquered nature through force and technology. They had bent entire worlds to their will. The humans had done the opposite. They had learned to bend themselves to the will of life itself. Your collapse, he said slowly. It wasn't an ending. It was a transformation. Hannah nodded. The greatest gift our ancestors gave us wasn't their technology or their knowledge. It was their willingness to completely change what it meant to be human. They died as one kind of being and were reborn as another. The archive fell silent except for the gentle pulsing of the walls. Cale realized he was no longer looking at the ruins of a failed civilization. He was looking at the birth of something entirely new, the elevator that carried them down beneath. Soul felt more like falling through the veins of a living creature than riding in a machine. The walls glowed with soft patterns that pulsed in. Rhythm with something Cale couldn't identify. As they descended deeper, he felt a strange pressure in his mind, as if something vast was trying to speak to him. We're going to the heart of everything, Hannah said softly as the elevator slowed. The place where all our memories live. When the doors opened, Cale stepped into a cavern that stretched beyond what his eyes could see. The walls were covered in what looked like veins made of light, branching and connecting in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed thick with electricity and something else, something that felt like thoughts. Welcome to the Memory Collective, said a man who appeared from the shadows between the glowing walls. He was middle-aged with calm eyes and hands that moved like those of someone who worked with delicate living things. I am Jin, one of the keepers here. Cale watched as Jin placed his palm against a section of wall that pulsed brighter at his touch. The organic circuits seemed to respond to him, sending waves of light racing through the network that disappeared into the darkness above and below. What is this place? Cale asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would be something his mind couldn't fully accept. This is where we keep the consciousness of everyone who lived through the Great Collapse, Jin explained. Not artificial intelligence. Not computer programs. The actual thoughts, feelings, and memories of real people who experienced our worlds. Death and rebirth. The alien delegation stood in stunned silence. In all their travels across the galaxy, they had never encountered anything like this. The technology required to preserve human consciousness was beyond their understanding, but, more than that, the purpose behind it was something no other species had ever attempted. Every mistake, every small victory, every moment of despair and hope from those dark years is preserved here, Jin continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. No child grows up without understanding exactly how close we came to extinction. They walked deeper into the cavern. Cale began to feel something he had never experienced before. Emotions that weren't his own started to creep into his mind. Fear, desperation, but also hope and determination. The memories of humans who had lived through the end of the world were somehow touching his thoughts. Don't fight it, advised a woman who joined them from another pathway. She was younger than Jin, with eyes that seemed to hold impossible depths. I am Yuna. I teach children how to connect with the network. Let the memories flow through you. Suddenly, Cale was somewhere else. The last drops of oil were extracted from the final well on Earth. He could feel the terror of the engineer who knew that this moment marked the end of everything his civilization had built. The man's hands shook as he sealed the empty well, knowing that millions would die because of what they had done to their world. Then He was in the mind of a woman working frantically in an underground laboratory. She was trying to merge human consciousness with the root systems of mushrooms, desperate to find a way for her species to survive. Her thoughts were filled with equations and hope, and the terrible knowledge that she might be humanity's last. Chance, the memory shifted again, and Cale experienced the profound grief of parents who had decided never to have children. They couldn't bear to bring new life into a world that was dying. Their sadness was so deep, it felt like drowning, but underneath it was a love so pure, it made his chest ache. Every generation carries the full weight of our failure and our recovery. They don't just learn about the collapse in books, they live it through the consciousness of those who survived it. Cale looked around at the vast network of preserved minds and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. His own people, the Vorthok, had advanced technology and controlled many worlds, but they had never faced the kind of complete destruction that would force them to completely reimagine their existence. "We've had problems," he said slowly, "but nothing like this. Nothing that would require us to become something entirely different." Hannah nodded with understanding. Most successful species are trapped by their success. They become so good at what they do that they can't change when they need to. They keep doing the same things, even when those things stop working. Jin gestured to the glowing walls around them. The collapse forced us to break every pattern we had ever known. We had to learn to think like the planet itself, to feel like the forests and oceans feel, to become part of the web of life instead of standing outside it. Forgotten how to transform. Success can be its own trap. Cale thought about his own civilization. They had conquered world after world, always using the same methods, always thinking the same thoughts. They had never been forced to question whether their way of life was sustainable or wise. They had never had to die and be reborn. "We preserve these memories," Yuna added, "not to torture ourselves with the past, but to make sure we never forget how to change when change is necessary." As they prepared to leave the memory collective, Cale realized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their impossible technology or their harmony with nature. It was their willingness to let their old selves die so that something better could be born. The warning alarms began screaming across the Vorthok homeworld at exactly 14:23 local time. In the massive control center beneath the capital city, technicians stared at their screens in disbelief as red lights flashed everywhere. The primary energy grid that had powered their civilization for over 1,000 years was failing. "Sir, the cascade is spreading faster than we can contain it," reported the chief engineer, his voice tight with panic. "We're losing power to essential systems across 3 star systems." Cale, now returned from his mission to Earth, watched the crisis unfold with growing horror. The Vorthok had built their entire civilization on a network of interconnected power stations that drew energy from the cores of planets. It was efficient, reliable, and had never failed before. But now, as each station went dark, it triggered failures in the others. Within days, the crisis had spread beyond technical problems. Suddenly found themselves in darkness. Food production stopped, transportation systems failed, communications went dead. Panic spread faster than wildfire. The response was swift and predictable. The Galactic Council called emergency sessions. Military fleets were dispatched to maintain order. Engineers worked around the clock to repair the damaged systems. Resources were redistributed from stable worlds to failing ones. Every solution followed the same pattern that had worked for thousands of years. But this time nothing worked. The military couldn't fight a technical failure. The resource redistribution only delayed the inevitable collapse. Each attempt to solve the crisis seemed to make it worse. "We're losing entire civilizations," Cale reported to the Council after 2 months of failed attempts. "The Zalarian Empire has fragmented into warring factions. The Kepler colonies are experiencing mass starvation. 3 species have already gone extinct." Council chamber, once filled with confident voices, had become a place of desperate whispers. Leaders who had ruled stable worlds for their entire lives found themselves facing problems they couldn't comprehend. They had no experience with true failure, no knowledge of how to survive when everything they had built came crashing down. That's when the message from Earth arrived. It wasn't what anyone expected. There's no offer of advanced technology to fix their power grids. No proposal for military assistance to stop the wars, no shipments of resources to feed the starving. Instead, it was something that seemed almost insulting in its simplicity. "We would like to send teachers," the message read. Nah. 30. People who have lived through collapse and recovery. They cannot fix your problems, but they can help you learn from them. The council's initial reaction was anger. Teachers. They needed weapons, technology, solutions. What could a handful of humans possibly do that their greatest minds couldn't accomplish? But as the crisis deepened and their conventional solutions continued to fail, desperation began to override pride. The first human ship arrived during what many considered the darkest hour in galactic history. The man who stepped off the ship was nothing like what the council had expected. Tay was quiet, middle-aged, with gentle eyes and hands that moved with careful precision. He didn't wear impressive uniforms or carry advanced weapons. He looked like someone who might teach children or tend gardens. "We're not here to fix your problems," he explained to the desperate council members. "We're here to help you learn from them." With him came others who seemed equally ordinary. Nari was a woman who spoke softly, but whose words carried the weight of someone who had helped rebuild entire societies. Wu was a man whose understanding of ecosystems went beyond anything in the galactic databases. Yun was a woman whose calm presence somehow made even the most panicked leaders feel like they could think clearly again. The humans' approach was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of rushing to the most critical failures, they sat with small communities and listened. They asked questions that seemed simple, but revealed complex patterns that had been invisible before. "Why do you think this happened?" Tay asked a group of Orthoc engineers who had been working without sleep for weeks. "The systems failed," they replied, confused by the basic question. "But why were you so dependent on systems that could fail?" He pressed gently. Slowly, the engineers began to see that their crisis wasn't really about broken machines. It was about a way of thinking that had made them vulnerable to this kind of collapse. They had built their entire civilization on the assumption that growth and efficiency were the only important values. They had never considered what would happen if those systems stopped working. "We call this generous failure," Nari explained to a group of planetary leaders whose worlds were tearing themselves apart. "Instead of seeing breakdown as something to fight, we learned to see it as information. Your crisis is telling you something important about how you've been living." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but slowly, impossibly, it began to work. Communities that had been fighting over scarce resources started finding ways to share and cooperate. The Vorthok discovered that their crisis had revealed dependencies and vulnerabilities they had never recognized. With human guidance, they began transforming these weaknesses into strengths. Most surprising of all, they began to realize that their collapse might not be the end of their civilization. It might be the beginning of something better. The Great Hall on Kepler Prime had been built from the ruins of the old planetary government building. 2 years ago, this world had been consumed by civil war as their resource systems collapsed. Now, representatives from hundreds of species gathered in a space that seemed to pulse with new life. Its walls grown from living materials that the inhabitants had learned to cultivate during their darkest hours. Kale walked through the crowd, marveling at how much had changed. The Vorthok delegation wore simple clothes instead of their traditional military uniforms. Their faces, once proud and stern, now carried the quiet confidence of people who had learned to find strength in vulnerability. Around them, beings from dozens of worlds shared stories of their own transformations. 2 years ago, we would have called this gathering impossible, said Zara, Kepler representative, whose species had nearly destroyed itself in resource wars. We were too busy fighting each other to imagine we could learn from our failures. Near the center of the hall, a group of children from different worlds played together with toys that seemed to grow and change as they touched them. These were the first generation to grow up during the Great Transformation, and they moved with an ease that their parents had never possessed. They had learned to see change not as something to fear, but as a natural part of existence. Hannah stepped to the center of the hall, and the crowd gradually fell silent. She looked older than when Kale had first met her, but her eyes held a depth that spoke of witnessing incredible change. Around her, other humans stood quietly, their presence somehow making the vast space feel intimate and safe. 2 years ago, many of your worlds were dying, she began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. Your leaders came to us asking for solutions, for technology, for weapons to fight your problems. We gave you something different. She gestured to the diverse crowd around her. We gave you the knowledge that failure is not the end of the story. That breakdown can become breakthrough. The darkest moment often comes just before the dawn. The audience, Kale saw faces that told the story of galactic transformation. Leaders who had once ruled through fear now listened to their people with genuine curiosity. Scientists who had once sought to dominate nature now worked as partners. With living systems, warriors who had once solved problems through force now understood that the greatest battles were fought within themselves. What we've learned, Hannah continued, is that intelligence alone isn't enough. Having smart people and advanced technology doesn't guarantee survival. True wisdom comes from surviving your own success, from learning to change when change is necessary. A young Vorthok engineer named Kira stood up from the audience. Kale remembered her from the early days of the crisis, when she had worked desperately to repair the failing energy systems. Now she looked calm and centered, her hands glowing with the same bioluminescent patterns that marked humans who had learned to work with living technology. Before the collapse, Kira said, we thought strength meant never failing. We built our entire civilization around avoiding problems. When the crisis came, we had no idea how to handle it because we had never learned to fail gracefully. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Every species represented had experienced their own version of the same pattern. Success had made them rigid, unable to adapt when their old ways stopped working. The humans taught us that failure is information, added an elderly Zolarian whose world had been torn apart by civil war. Instead of hiding from our mistakes, we learned to study them. Instead of fighting our problems, we learned to listen to what they were trying to tell us. Hannah nodded, her expression full of quiet pride. We didn't give you our technology because technology wasn't what you needed. We gave you our scars, our hard-won knowledge of how to transform pain into wisdom. The hall fell silent as beings from across the galaxy reflected on their own transformations. They had learned to build societies that could bend without breaking, to create systems that grew stronger under pressure, to find opportunity in the midst of crisis. Earth's greatest export, Hannah said, was never our impossible cities or our bio-integrated technology. It was hope. It's a proven knowledge that even the darkest failure could become the seed of unprecedented transformation. As the gathering continued, Kale found himself thinking about his own people. The Vorthok had once been conquerors spreading across the galaxy through force and superior technology. Now they were learners, students of the art of conscious evolution. Their old empire had collapsed, but something far more valuable had taken its place. The humans moved through the crowd, like teachers among students, but also like students among teachers. They had learned as much from the galaxy's transformation as they had given. Each species had found its own way to dance with crisis, turn breakdown into breakthrough. As the formal sessions ended and beings began to share meals and stories, Kale realized that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy. The age of conquest and domination was ending. In its place, a new era was beginning, one based on cooperation, transformation, and the understanding that the greatest strength came not from avoiding failure, but from learning to fail forward. The humans had turned their greatest catastrophe into their greatest gift to the universe. And in doing so, they had shown every conscious being that no matter how dark the night, dawn was always possible for those brave enough to transform themselves.